Often when discussing the 32-bit systems PlayStation and Saturn, multi-platform games are almost always assumed to look, run, and sound better on the PlayStation. Since these two systems shared a fair number of titles, there are actually many instances where the two platforms could be directly compared. In this episode, we will be deep diving Electronic Arts' popular racing game, The Need for Speed. Does the PlayStation version live up to the common belief of unquestioned superiority, or does the Saturn version hold its own and spit in the face of assumption? Let's take a look. The first thing that catches your attention between these two is the full motion video opening that both of these games have. Despite being the same game, they open with different sequences. Using the US versions for the test, and after the company identifiers play out, both games have a sequence depicting exotic cars in the game. This sequence is different, showing basically the same cars, but cut in different scenes. The quality of the full motion video is actually really good across both versions, but you will notice a little more pixelation artifacts in the Saturn edition, though the PlayStation version does display a smaller screen of video. Allowing the full motion video to play out leads us directly into the loading of the title screen. The two versions of the game differ a bit here as well. Leading into that title screen, the Saturn version employs a dedicated loading screen before the title screen ever pops up. The PlayStation game goes right into the title screen and appears to load from there. If we allow the two games to run together, the Saturn version is up and running sooner and you're able to choose your game and start. It's also interesting to note that if you allow the game to sit for a while, they both launch into their demo or attract modes, with the PlayStation version showing some awful full motion video of gameplay, and the Saturn version actually showing you the in-game engine running. When it comes to options, the two games are mostly the same, with a few notable differences. When you go into the options, you are met with pretty much the same settings. You can adjust the audio levels, you can change the controls around to suit your taste, or you can mess around with the save memory, and even watch the credits. Game modes mirror one another as well. You get a choice of time trial, head-to-head, single race, and tournament, with each being fairly self-explanatory as to what they're about. The PlayStation has a slight load in between each of these selections, while the Saturn zips right through them with no delays. Both of these versions received extra tracks over the 3DO release, as well as an option to change the time of day you wish to race. The major option that separates these two versions is the Link mode found in the PlayStation version. This allows you to use two systems, two copies of the game, and two televisions to play versus multiplayer. It used the PlayStation's link cable functionality, and while the Saturn hardware itself has this ability, it was never released officially outside of Japan for much of anything. Often the point of contention between the same games on different platforms are the graphics. Here, the Need for Speed for both the Saturn and PlayStation received major upgrades over the 3DO original. The most obvious of these improvements reside in the speed and frame rate in which they run. Both games are noticeably smoother and run much faster than the 3DO original, changing not only the look of the experience overall, but also affecting how the game plays. Both of them run great overall and are extremely comparable. They have very consistent frame rates, neither suffering any major drops that I noticed in my gameplay capture. A cursory evaluation of the images also appear to show the two games running at slightly different resolutions, but both remain sharp and well detailed overall. Honestly, there are only really 3 noticeable differences that I feel are worth noting here. The first is in favor of the PlayStation, and it involves the lighting and transparencies the engine features. There appears to be a legitimate colored lighting system in place in certain areas, and the transparent smoke looks much better than the flat solid coloring on the Saturn. The second notable difference involves the texture warping happening on the PlayStation release. This mostly manifests in the road textures right in front of the car. The idea here is to basically try and hide the eyesore of warping by moving fast enough to make it unnoticeable. But when you put it side by side with a version that doesn't do it nearly as bad, it is not as easily overlooked. The final thing of note is that the background plane is rendered differently between the two platforms. The Saturn has a still backdrop that doesn't sway with your car, while the PlayStation version has a slight rotation effect to it left and right. I feel it will boil down to your preference on how these two methods work, as neither are a side effect of some deficiency in the hardware. None of these differences actually make either game look bad, however, and both are quite comparable 99% of the time. Neither are the best looking racers on their systems, but both still hold up fairly well. I would like to take a moment to note that I have read multiple places that the Saturn game supposedly doesn't have working dials on the dashboard of the cars. I own the US Saturn release and have for years, and the dials have always worked in every single car. Sound and music between the two versions are quite similar as well. Tires screech nice and good, the engine sounds great, and the rock music blaring in the background helps push along the action. The PlayStation version does have the Dolby surround sound notice on the title screen, something the Saturn version doesn't. My capture setup isn't capable of Dolby surround, so I can only assume it's there. Both sound great in stereo, however, and I have no real complaints about either one. I would also like to bring up again the point that in some comparisons on the internet, the Saturn version is said to not have race music. This is again not the case with the US Saturn version I own. Every track has race music, and I have run into no issues with it not starting at the beginning of a race or stopping entirely during the gameplay. Again, there is an issue with the test software somewhere, or there are indeed differences in the various releases of the Saturn game. Gameplay is an area often ignored when comparing versions of the same game across multiple platforms. How does the game play with the default controllers of the system? Are there any differences in responsiveness or gameplay? This oft-overlooked section in the comparison actually means the most, as long as something else isn't broken visually with the engine, and there are differences between these two versions of the game. Both have very similar gameplay overall, and you'll feel similar responses with both controllers and in how each car feels on the track. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that the Saturn game allowed me to turn easier on a few really sharp turns, something I first attributed simply to my preference for the Saturn's control pad. The more I played, the more I felt this on almost a consistent basis. I of course can offer you no concrete evidence this exists other than my feeling, but I can show you a bit in my gameplay capture here. In the Rusty Springs track in both versions, using the same car, the sharpest turn on the course is managed easily on the Saturn game by slowing down, easing into the turn, and holding the pattern. No matter how hard I tried, I needed to slow down way more to take the turn on the PlayStation. It just felt like the car wanted to drift harder to the outside of the turn no matter how I went into it. I will not say one is better than the other, but there is certainly a difference in the feel to me. The good news is that there's nothing here that hurts either edition in terms of fun factor. Even if you account for the slight difference I perceived, they play remarkably similar and are both equally enjoyable. In conclusion, I can only say that this is a fine example of how a 3D Saturn game could hold up quite well when compared to a PlayStation version of the same game. There are of course various differences, but the core of this experience is largely the same, to the point where these differences are negligible in the overall narrative. Both versions look good, run good, and play good. No platform got shafted here, neither exhibiting a superiority that made the other a lesser experience. This was not always the case with every game that was available on both platforms, but it sure was the case here. You can't go wrong with either one of these games if you are a fan of the old school Need for Speed gameplay. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.